"Buy my bike, sir. Dad hasn't eaten in 2 days." The words came out of a small mouth like a coin dropped into an empty jar. They landed on the pavement and on the morning air, and for a second everything else, the mailman's whistle, the sprinklers down the block, the hum of an air conditioner, seemed to step aside to listen. They rode in like thunder. 4 bikes rolled down the quiet street, leather and chrome catching the sun so it looked like someone had scattered mirrors across the asphalt. Ryder, called Wolf by the others, led the pack. Broad shoulders, a scar in the corner of one eye that never told a story. Behind him, Tank's laugh was low as a drum. Viper rode with an impatience that made his fingers drum the handlebars. Mason watched everything like he was cataloging evidence. They slowed because of the girl and the cardboard. Meera stood by the curb with a bike the color of bubblegum and a sign scrawled in a child's hand. Her knees were scabbed, her hair had been tucked too quickly that morning. She looked smaller than her words. Ryder felt the sound fold inward. The engine's purr dropped to a sympathetic growl. "Buy my bike, sir," she repeated, and then, as if she had been rehearsing a heavier sentence, added, "Dad hasn't eaten in 2 days." Neighbors peered through blinds. An old woman watering geraniums paused, watering can mid-air, like she'd been handed a question she couldn't answer easily. A dog barked, then fell quiet. Ryder shut off his ignition, and the sudden absence of that low thunder made the street feel hollow, not empty. It made it possible to hear the scrape of Meera's thumb along the cardboard edge. He dismounted, boots heavy on the concrete. Up close, Meera's sign looked less like a plea and more like a list of things the neighborhood had stopped seeing. A name, a price, a small drawing of a son. Ryder crouched so he was almost at her level. He did not ask where her father worked or demand proof. He listened. "He's Daniel," Meera said quickly, as if filling a blank. "He lost his job 2 months back. He can't get steady work 'cause Mr. Hensley's plant closed the day the new contract came in. He's been—" She stopped, eyes blown wide. "Dad hasn't eaten." Neighbors peered through blinds. An old woman watering geraniums paused, watering can mid-air, like she'd been handed a question she couldn't answer easily. A dog barked, then fell quiet. Ryder shut off his ignition, and the sudden absence of that low thunder made the street feel hollow, not empty. It made it possible to hear the scrape of Meera's thumb along the cardboard edge. He dismounted, boots heavy on the concrete. Up close, Meera's sign looked less like a plea and more like a list of things the neighborhood had stopped seeing. A name, a price, a small drawing of a son. Ryder crouched so he was almost at her level. He did not ask where her father worked or demand proof. He listened. "He's Daniel," Meera said quickly, as if filling a blank. "He lost his job 2 months back. He can't get steady work 'cause Mr. Hensley's plant closed the day the new contract came in. He's been—" She stopped, eyes blown wide. "Dad hasn't eaten." Ryder pressed cash into her hand, not much by some measures, enough for a week's worth of bread and 2 cans. He promised to be back. It was what men of his kind did when confronted with hunger and small hands, give immediate relief and a story you could sleep on. But when he stood and felt Meera's gaze, something else pulled tight in his chest. Not charity, not exactly, but a twinge of indignation that tasted like heat. He felt it as a stubborn engine might feel a bad spark, a problem you couldn't ignore. "That's when he stopped being a stranger to it," Mason later said, recounting the moment over the rumble of a cafe espresso machine. "He didn't want to sleep knowing a girl had to sell her bike to feed her own father." Ryder gathered Tank, Viper, Mason. They rode through neighborhoods with the kind of silence that made you hear your own tires. The glass front of Hensley Industries caught the afternoon and threw it back, slick and bright, the headquarters of decisions made far from the faces they would change.
There were reporters' logos on the lobby directory, a marble floor that swallowed sound. The bikers' jackets scraped a different kind of music against the polished elevator doors. They didn't shout. They didn't break a window. There was no threat beyond the sight of 4 men who refused to leave until someone listened. Ryder carried Meera's card folded twice in his pocket like a mandate. He thought of how reputations were sometimes the one currency people in suits were still afraid to lose. He thought of the quiet way the town watched and weighed morality like a ledger. When they reached Mr. Hensley's office, they asked to see him. The secretary's eyebrow arched the moment a man with chrome on his hips and a child's cardboard in another man's hand stepped into her pristine lobby. Ryder placed the folded sign on the receptionist's counter and said simply, "We need to speak to Mr. Hensley about Daniel. It's about the people who used to work at the plant." It is one thing to imagine power, another to bring a human story into the temple of that power. They did not barge in, they asked, and the asking became the first soft knock on the edifice. Hensley's office looked like a photograph of success, a long desk, a wall of certificates, a clock that told time like an accusation. Mr. Hensley, who had signed off on moving operations and tightening contracts, lifted the cardboard as if it might crumble. The ink was smudged by Meera's small, anxious fingers. "She says her dad hasn't eaten in 2 days," Ryder said. He did not shout. His voice had a steady weight that did not lean on anger, but simply made the information undeniable. Hensley read the sign. He read the name Daniel. For a thin beat, the room was all glass and air conditioning and the distant noise of life going on elsewhere. The sound of a pen tapping on a ledger seemed too small to hold what was happening. "I don't know all the circumstances," Hensley offered, the kind of cautious line executives use when habits and people collide. "You don't have to know them all," Viper replied. "You made a choice. That choice moved homes, moved paychecks, moved food. These are your neighbors now." There was a silence that was not respectful but practical, the kind that measures consequences. Hensley's face tightened, then relaxed as if at a decision made more from calculation than conscience. The bikers weren't demanding his resignation or a televised apology. They were holding up a life and asking him, in front of witnesses, to do what was right. "What will you do?" Ryder asked. "Not for press, not for photo ops, for this man and his daughter." Hensley looked at Meera and at the folded cardboard, and the clock seemed to slow. Outside the suite, a security guard cleared his throat. Somewhere in the building, a phone vibrated on a polished table. Hensley signed a check, not a PR check, but one that his assistant wrote out with his authorization. Payments to cover Daniel's immediate bills, groceries delivered that evening, a line item for rehiring conversations. He also agreed to review the plant's layoffs and speak to the union on the record. Words like review and reconsideration can be small technical things, but they move the mechanics behind people's lives. The bikers left the office with nothing theatrical. They had a few receipts and a plan. Recompense in the form of food arrived at Meera's doorstep by dusk. Brown paper bags, unopened loaves, tins that smelled like possibility. But it was what came next that mattered most. Not the immediate groceries, but the public acknowledgement that someone in power had to answer to the face of a child selling a bike. A reputation, once cracked by the image of a hungry man and a cardboard sign, begins to leak. The local paper ran a short piece, factual and without flourish, showing a photograph of a small bike and a folded sign. Neighbors called in favors. Donations pooled. The rehiring talk across a boardroom table turned into a small committee evaluation. Mr. Hensley's company issued a statement promising to audit their layoff procedures and to fund a community relief effort. They did not do it because a biker gang had threatened them. They did it because the cost of not responding had become a visible stain on a brand that relied on trust. Back on the street where Meera had stood, the night arrived soft and orange. Daniel sat on the stoop with a paper plate and a slice of bread. The first bite he took seemed to make a sound like someone letting out the breath they'd been holding for too long. Meera watched him like she was learning how to be hopeful. Around them, the bikers kept a respectful distance, leaning against their machines as if the chrome itself wanted to witness the ordinary miracle of a meal. "You okay?" Ryder asked Daniel quietly. Daniel's hands trembled as he answered, "I didn't want her to know. I couldn't stand seeing her look so small because—" He stopped, the wrong word lodged in his throat. "You weren't small," Meera told him, as if determined to set the record straight. "You were Dad. That's not small." They shared the bread. It wasn't a feast, but it was real food, passed hand to hand. Ryder watched the way Daniel's fingers closed around a piece of crust and felt how dignity can be restored by simple things. A chair at a table, the chance to feed someone else. The bikers didn't stand over them like conquerors. They sat a little ways away and let the scene exist without turning it into a spectacle. A week later, there were steady shifts. Daniel was called in for a conversation about temporary work, then for a training program funded in part by the company's relief measure. A small envelope with reimbursement for back bills arrived. Community volunteers came by to clean the yard and fix the bike's kickstand. Meera rode the same bike down the block, slower, as if relearning to trust the world's motion. Ryder walked one evening with Meera to the corner where she once held the cardboard. She folded the sign and handed it to him. He unfolded it and refolded it with careful fingers. "Keep it," she said, "so you remember." He slid it into the inner pocket of his jacket. The sun set the houses on fire with gentle orange light. The chrome on the bikes reflected that dusk into tiny, honest stars. It had started with a sound that didn't belong, the roar of engines on a sleepy street, and it had turned into a quieter sound that did, people taking responsibility for one another. There were no speeches, no grandstanding. There was only the steady accrual of small acts. Groceries in an empty pantry, a phone call that led to a paycheck, a conversation that led to rehiring. The bikers had forced nothing by force. They had leveraged attention and testimony and the human cost of policies into a public conversation. Hensley had chosen to respond. Whether he did it for the right reasons mattered less than the fact that he did it at all. The results were tangible. Bills marked paid. A name that could be called for work. A daughter who didn't have to sell her bicycle to buy bread. On the night the street emptied, Ryder rested his palm on Meera's bike. He could still feel the ridges where little fingers gripped the handles. He thought about how easily people can become invisible in the shadow of contracts and quarterly reports. He thought about how difficult it is to be small in a world that values size. He thought about how sometimes the people you expect to be the softest, a child, a neighbor, a man on a stoop, are the ones who make the hardest appeals. Meera tucked her free hand into her father's and stared at Ryder. "Will you come visit?" she asked. "We'll ride by," Ryder promised, "and we'll bring enough to share." He kept his word. They brought food, and sometimes they fixed things. They brought news about a workshop that could teach Daniel a new skill. They did not become saviors. They became neighbors who had the capacity to use their voice where others had it quieter. The change was not magical. It was human. It was messy and bureaucratic and at times frustratingly slow, but it was real. Before he left that evening, Ryder pulled the folded cardboard from his pocket. He smoothed it out and wrote nothing on it. He handed it back to Meera, and she slipped it into a box with school papers and crayons. It was a small monument, a reminder that dignity had been defended not by spectacle, but by witnesses who would not look away.
If this touched you, share this story to remind someone kindness still matters. At the end, the bicycle stayed by the tree for a long time, its paint nicked but its tire holding air.
The sign was folded and put away. The father ate that night and the next.